This episode is brought to you by AMC and AMC Plus, presenting the critically acclaimed second season of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, praised as one of the year's most rewarding and remarkable hours of television by IndieWire, starring Jacob Anderson, Sam Reed, and Delaney Hales. For your consideration, go to amcfyc.com for more.
You know, New Line, for better or worse, did make a lot of movies that other places had refused to make. You know, Austin Powers, we were the last stop. You know, we weren't the first stop for Boogie Nights either. Seven had been around as a turnaround project for a while. So we were not afraid of trying things that we liked, even if other people had passed on them or decided not to make them. You know, there were certain movies I think only could have gotten made with us.
Welcome back to Hollywood Stories, Tales of the 90s. So this is the last week of this season, but is hopefully the first season of many of Hollywood Stories. I've really enjoyed this, reliving this particular thrilling time with you. And, you know, what stands out for me about the 90s is, and what's kind of heartbreaking to me, is just hearing how much fun everyone had in this era. You listen to the stories, and it was just a place that people just felt so lucky to get to work in, and a place where whatever people were doing, they loved coming to work, they wanted to come to work. There were all sorts of problems, to be sure, and those would certainly surface in the decades that followed. But it was on screen and off a place where people were just taking risks and making things happen. And how much of that spirit is absent today from Hollywood is really striking. And that's what stands out to me listening to these tales of the 90s. So it's kind of been bittersweet. I love remembering it, and it is striking how much that spirit is gone. Today's episode, which is our last one of this first season, focuses on a place that was really at the epicenter of that freewheeling, risk-taking moment. The story of film in the 90s is very much a story of the rise of independent film, and a story in which two companies in very different ways were the major players. One on the more refined, prestigious side, there was Miramax, with all that its founder, Harvey Weinstein, brought to that story. And on the other end, there was New Line, the brash, cool upstarts staffed by a cohort of 20-somethings making an unbelievable array of great films. The array of talented executives who came out of New Line is really mind-blowing today. Not only today's guests, Michael De Luca and Richard Brener, but Toby Emmerich, Donna Langley, and Mary Parent, among many others, all began their careers at New Line during this decade. You know, living in Hollywood at that time, the New Line headquarters there on Robertson above the Newsroom Cafe really just felt like the coolest place on earth. And the movies they put out were an unbelievable array of films. Here's a partial list of New Line's output from the 1990s. House Party, Metropolitan, Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, Glengarry Glen Ross, Menace to Society, Gettysburg, Dumb and Dumber, Friday, Seven, Long Kiss Goodnight, Austin Powers, Boogie Nights, Wag the Dog, The Wedding Singer, Dark City, Blade, Rush Hour, Living Out Loud, American History X, and Magnolia. And that is just the tip of the iceberg, all from one company in one decade. So today we're talking to two who made that company and who continue to make it and preside over it today. Michael De Luca was the golden boy of Hollywood, rising to the helm of New Line as head of production unbelievably in his early 20s, while presiding over the company's golden age. Richard Brener began his career at New Line just out of college and is still there today, presiding as its current president as the company continues to thrive as a maker largely of horror films. They're Warner Brothers. So I hope you enjoy our conversations with the two of them. It is a fascinating place at a fascinating moment, and thank you to both of them for joining us today. I looked up the New Line films just in the 1990s, and the list of classic films that still hold up is insane. Why do you think that was, and what do you think made the New Line movie? I mean, it's really, you have everything from Boogie Nights to Seven to Friday, Gettysburg, Glengarry Glen Ross. I mean, it's such a
eclectic slate.
Yeah, eclectic slate, but all like, none of them are cookie cutter films. They're all interesting movies. And the sheer number was really staggering. How'd you do it?
You know, part of it came baked into the business plan. So when I got to New Line as a college intern in the 80s, it was kind of a first wave of independent companies because of the VHS boom. There was a real need for movies. So that's how New Line sprouted up. And at the same time, you may remember companies like Vestron, De Laurentiis, Canon releasing Atlantic releasing. So we were all trying to do things that the big studios weren't doing. And we also had, severe limitations on available capital. You were kind of locked into lower budget acquisitions and films. By their very nature, like what you were able to do had to be things with new talent and new voices, and also things that people weren't getting from the major studios. So that all kind of coalesced into a business plan of sleeper hits by necessity, because those are the only kind of movies that were available to all of us. We just happened to be in a boom time, which allowed for a lot of production to happen. So it was that kind of happy confluence of events.
So welcome, Richard Brener.
Thank you.
Welcome to the podcast.
It's my first podcast.
You've never been on a podcast?
No way.
Really?
No, I'm already regretting this one.
How? Welcome to the Land of Podcast. Welcome to 2010 media. So I want to kind of start at the end here.
Has the end already happened? Is this how I find out?
The end of the 90s.
Oh, okay.
It has happened, thankfully. Some of us are still there. But when I was preparing for this, I looked at the list of New Line movies in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And it's an insane list.
Yeah.
Like the number of classic, like all-time classic, like top 100 films like that are on there is crazy. So how'd you do it?
I didn't, thankfully. That's probably why that's the end of the list of the great New Line movies.
Yeah. How did New Line do it? How did the company do it? What was in the...
There were a couple, I think, prevailing... Well, there were, obviously, I do think a lot of it, obviously, is credit to Mike and Bob, particularly, and maybe even more so Mike and era that I'm aware of, because I started in May 1st, 95 was my first day as a temp. But so I think there was this incredible run that had this combination of, I think we ended up getting credit, I think, for moves and decisions that looked probably more risky than they actually were. Like, for instance, Austin Powers is, a fantastic movie, and that whole movie franchise probably could be a podcast of its own. But you could reduce it pretty simply to like a spoof or parody of a Bond film. There are many in that genre. I mean, obviously it's elevated and better than all the others. And I think everybody else in town passed, and Mike saw it for what it was. And Mike Myers is obviously a genius. But it's not as risky and as crazy as it may be.
No, but nobody else would take the risk.
Right,
so
sure. Same with Seven is a cop procedural. It just happens to be directed by a brilliant filmmaker and written by Andy Kevin Walker. And I don't know. I think Mike saw those things that other people didn't. And, a lot of it was, I don't think we were the first stop for a lot of people. So you had to kind of find the diamond in the rough.
Well, there was something in the water there that you all had great instincts for finding those diamonds.
So, yeah.
Let's go back to you getting your internship there. How that happened. Where were you in school?
So I went to NYU Film School, and I just seen the first Nightmare on Elm Street, and horror films were kind of my first love. I noticed New Line had a distinct logo in the 80s. It was a flashing, almost seizure-inducing logo. It was like New Line in block letters with flashing red colors. I just remembered it in front of Nightmare on Elm Street. I was a Wes Craven fan anyway.
Sure.
So that got me to see that movie. When I was looking at the internship bulletin board at NYU, because it was prehistoric era, so you just posted index cards with a thumbtack. That was the grapevine for available internships. I noticed that New Line had posted for an internship. I had just seen the movie, knew the company, and went and applied for it.
And where was their office in New York?
Their office was on 38th Street and 8th Avenue, a few blocks from the Port Authority.
Wow. So what was that like as a college student coming into that office? And
yeah, it was very bustling. It had startup energy, even though he had formed it, I think, in 1967, because it was in that boom time in the 80s. There was a lot of activity going on. As a kid walking in off the street at 19, it was a great entree into the business side of the film industry.
Do you remember your first day interning there?
Yeah, well, I remember my interview. I was really nervous and shy about going in. So they had a hallway off the elevators before you actually went into the office. And I paced back and forth for 20 minutes. My only job experience was part-time at a bagel store in Brooklyn. I was just a student, and I hadn't really been around grown-ups except my teachers and my bosses at the bagel store. And Bob Shaye's assistant at the time, this woman named Anita Lucioni, I guess there was a security camera and they just saw someone loitering in that hallway. It was me. So she came out and said, "What are you doing here?" And then I identified myself for the interview. She brought me in and it went well.
What were your jobs as an intern there? What did they assign you to do?
Part-time receptionist, part-time mailroom person, script reader. I entered collections from sub-distributors to book theaters and handle the films for exhibition. So I would enter collection reports of box office results and filing and attending to that kind of thing.
Did you love it immediately?
I loved all of it. Yeah. I was the kind of intern that would show up at 6 a.m. and leave at midnight and try to absorb as much as I could.
Did you lose interest in learning in class at that point?
It's hard to compete. I found academia hard to compete with the real world and being in the real business. So I did start to spend more time at the office than in school. I ended up blowing my chance to graduate because I was 4 credits shy. I never technically graduated at NYU until 1995. After I had been on the job for a while and became known in the industry, I called NYU and said, "Would you waive those 4 credits so I can at least say I'm a college graduate and get that treasured BFA that I know is prized by everybody?" So they did that for me. So I technically graduated with the class of 1995.
You didn't offer to go back and take 2 more classes?
I said whatever it would take. I said they were kind enough to waive it.
So when you graduated, did you go straight from graduating to a job there? Or did
they offered me a job in my junior year, actually. I started working there the second I wasn't a full-time student and just kind of grew with the company. It was one of those circumstances where you join something on the ground floor when it's small, and in success it grew, and I was able to grow with it into higher levels of responsibility.
And what was the first job you had?
Story editor. So just kind of minding the business of the story department, facilitating the script readers, making sure things went out for coverage and the readers got paid, and then writing note. I wrote a lot of coverage myself and wrote up a lot of notes on things.
So tell me about your, before you got your temp job at New Line, what were you doing then?
Well, I just pretty much got out of college. I was a comedy writer in college. I had been asked to speak at our college graduation. I was the comedy person at the school. And right before, our main speaker at graduation was the comedy person. So I did that, and I thought, well, there have been other people who have done that and gone into entertainment. I'm like, well, maybe I can do that. So I decided I wasn't going to go to law school after all. I told my dad, my parents, I'm not going to law school. My dad said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to go to LA and write a movie." And my dad said, "Rent a movie?" And I said, "No, write a movie." And he said, "Damn." And drove across the country and waited tables a little bit and started a temp job at New Line, still with the thought of maybe being a writer at some point, not knowing what a studio executive did, maybe still not knowing what a studio executive does, but definitely didn't know then.
So tell me about the first day at work at New Line.
So I was offered a job, a permanent job, the very first day at temp, because I think the expectations for temps are probably as low as possible. First of all, I wanted to work at Sony. They offered $14 an hour. New Line was only offering $10. I didn't know enough to know that New Line would be a place where I would love all the movies and it would be my, destination for the next 30 years. But I really wanted that extra $4 an hour. Didn't get that job. But my first job, I was working for a contract administrator at lunch for the very first day I've ever worked in the entertainment business. My boss was on the phone and a food delivery came for her. And I brought her the food and she's like, "Where's the guy?" I was like, "Oh, I paid him." She's like, "You did what?" I thought she was mad at me. I was like, "Well, it was $8 and I gave him 10. And I figured you either pay me back or I'm out $10. And she said, "Will you come work for me? My assistant would never do that." So I said no, because I didn't want to be a contract administrator. But I ended up floating and worked in all the different departments. I worked in music, international, home video over the course of 4 or 5 months. I worked for Toby. Actually, I didn't work directly for him. I worked for Dana Sano, who was, and had an extended period in music. And at the time, they were doing the opening credits for Seven, the very famous Nine Inch Nails opening credits. And yeah, I don't know, I was in the right place at the right time. Our story editor left. And as a temp, I filled in for the story editor while they were looking for the permanent one. And then there was a kind of a tryout, since it took a while to find who that person was. And they let all the assistants and myself included do some coverage on Frequency, which later got made, that Toby wrote. And I didn't get that job. it went to Donna Langley. I don't know if you've heard of her.
Sure. Gone on to make a couple movies.
Yeah, so she's the chairwoman, or maybe even more than that now at this point at Universal. I'm just a lowly whoever I am. They were right to pick her. And then I was named staff reader. I was reading what, at the time, people were doing more spec scripts than pitches. So I was reading whatever the hot script of the day is. First script I ever read as a reader was My Best Friend's Wedding.
Oh, really?
And I gave it consider coverage, and I was lectured by one of the executives. You can't just give every script consider coverage.
It was 100% of your scripts you had given.
Yeah. And a week later, Julia Roberts signed on. Made me feel a little better.
You were new to Los Angeles. You're new to the industry. What did the New Line office seem like to you then?
I mean, I didn't know what to compare it to other than when I sold shoes in 9th grade. It was better than that. You know, it was intimidating at first. I had heard reputationally that New Line, the development executives were very close and they didn't like outsiders. My first temp job in the department before even being story editor was Donna was out of town. She was Lynn Harris's assistant. I filled in for Donna. And I guess in those 2 days, Lynn didn't hate me as much as they usually hate other outsiders. And so then I got more jobs inside of that department. I could tell they were really close. I didn't know much about the business. They seemed
so you were a 21-year-old looking at all these 26-year-olds.
Pretty much, yeah, exactly. They were young. You know, I just wanted to do a little bit more than what was expected.
Was it? I mean, did you all go out carousing every night? Or
yeah, I probably wasn't included in the early days, but pretty soon because we are kind of all in the same age range. Yeah, a lot of going to Chaya which was downstairs in our offices, and Mike had signing privileges that either he abused or we abused in his absence, and so that was a regular occurrence.
So Chaya at the time was the hottest restaurants in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right across the street from the Ivy. One of the other, that was a little bit more of an established place. A little probably further in your career, more of a lunch crowd. Chaya, at least with us, was kind of more like a happy hour and later experience. And they were great to us. We were great with them, and we had there was Oscar parties there in later years. And
what was it like being a young man in LA? You're working for one of the hottest film companies. You're making these great movies. I'm sure there's movie stars all over the Chaya coming up to your table.
I mean, definitely. I remember Paul Thomas Anderson and Mark Wahlberg in that era. And yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. Like I didn't know enough to know how special it was, to be honest. I mean, I knew I was very happy and the company was growing. I got very lucky to be there at a time when the new money from Ted Turner had come in, and Mike was taking, bigger shots, like give me Jim Carrey, $7 million in Dumb and Dumber. And like I said, Seven, which is an amazing movie. And I didn't know enough to know how lucky I was, but I was certainly incredibly happy and felt privileged.
What was Bob Shaye like?
He was very intimidating at first. And by at first, I mean the first 5 years I worked there. I think I know how to generally deal with people and, a very quick learner. He took me a while. He was incredibly loyal to the company. He treated everybody like a family. He was very tough. I think he thought that we were stealing his money if we didn't do well. Once I realized that might be what he was thinking, that made it a little bit easier to kind of understand his perspective.
He was coming from.
Yeah. He also was incredibly brave. And I think, it's obviously the very least to say he deserves credit because he started the whole thing and made those big giant bets, like obviously Lord of the Rings being one of the more famous ones. But on a daily basis, he was doing that. He was always asking us to push the limits, and he was a John Waters fan. He was a bold guy.
It's not often that the people at the top companies are encouraging their executives to take crazy chances.
Yeah. He also did say, "Would you bet your career on it?" almost every time you said, "I like this movie." The good news is he didn't actually,
take your career away.
Exactly. Usually you had another movie coming anyway behind it so that you were a little bit safer. I realized early on, might as well just say, yeah, I'd bet my career on
it. Tell me about Bob Shaye, what Bob Shaye was like.
He was a very, I think in a way, very brilliant about seeing a need at that time for the audience to have a counterculture experience. He started the company in 1967. They acquired a lot of foreign films. They were Bertrand Blier's distributor. He saw that the audience was shifting from boomers to hippies, ex-hippies, counterculture. This is before Gen X or hippies boomers. I always forget. They are kind of boomers. He programmed for a counterculture boomer demo and then recognized with us, because I think he allowed a lot of us to be hired. He recognized that a new audience was emerging with Gen X and they wanted to create their own movie stars. And there was an opportunity to not wait in line for, the stars of the day to get back to us, but to try to create new movie stars. And he understood the importance of the new and the innovative, and he understood the value of risk. And that's how he was able to build the company.
So this was the beginning of the golden age of the spec script there.
Yeah. I mean, we couldn't afford any spec script, so it was more. I was an observer of it from the sidelines. As the '80s kind of changed into the '90s, there was a second boom time, the DVD boom, which also caused a flurry of production activity, and New Line started to ramp up. And it was primarily acquisitions when I joined, and it became more productions.
At what point did you move to Los Angeles?
I moved to LA in 1990, yeah.
And what was your job at that point?
I think at that point I was a VP.
What was going on at this company that they let 20-year-olds be VPs?
I think because I started so young, they always looked at me as older than I was, just because I started as a teenager there. I had years on the job, and I was known to the people there, for almost half a decade. We were so outside the industry in terms of the mainstream industry because we were an independent company. This is before Ted Turner bought the studio. So I moved to LA when we were still truly independent. I didn't know what other companies were like because I was in the bubble for New Line. But I did, as I started to meet more people in the industry, there was a generational thing going on. Boomers were starting to cede some ground to Generation X. I did see a lot of Gen X in other parts of our business out here in LA. So it did seem like there was a little bit of a begrudging passing of the torch starting to happen.
Opening the door just a crack.
Just a crack, yeah.
Which is all they opened it for 30 more years.
I mean, if you ask me, boomers still have a hard time exiting the stage. But we'll see how we do. We'll see how Gen X does.
They haven't completely...
Yeah. I mean, I read a lot of articles where Gen X is also now being accused of not getting out. Well, the getting's good.
we didn't give up we never gave up our seat at the kids' table, so... You mentioned all these people like yourself who run Hollywood at this point, who were all young people there at the time. What was it in the New Line education there that everybody learned that?
I think one of the differences is and we still do it, I think now today at New Line, that learning by doing. We weren't on a big lot. We didn't have heavyweight producers that we could rely on. We were very hands-on, and we were credited in our movies, which gave us a little bit more of an identity outside of being just random executive, and we ate what we killed. You were judged on the success and failure, and you knew, I think we enjoyed our successes and rued our failures probably, because we knew we were partly more responsible for them.
What's the first project you recall really sinking your teeth into and getting involved here?
I had a really inauspicious first experience with, we had gotten the rights to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and we made a sequel called Leatherface, which you could also call kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, but it didn't turn out well, and it made Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 look like Citizen Kane. I thought I would never work again. I thought I had completely failed and wouldn't get another chance to manage another movie. I learned a lot.
What were the lessons of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, Leatherface?
Who directs is really, really important, because sometimes when you read a script, even when you've developed and you're a little biased towards it because you've been emotionally involved, you direct the movie in your mind as like a 5-star movie. And of course, if you have an imagination and you're a film buff, you're using techniques and kind of creating it in your mind as if the world's best filmmakers are going to shoot it. And then if you end up with someone who still has a lot to learn, and sometimes things go well, sometimes they can go sideways, the movie you get is so different than the movie you imagined as the executive or the reader. I learned a lot about that distance from what's in your head to what actually goes on screen and how it gets there. It was just all very new to me, but an invaluable experience.
What was the New Line approach to story development? What did you learn about all this as you came in there?
It was a little marketing driven, just in terms of, Bob Shaye used to say, we have to go where the big guys don't. how can we be innovative, or how can we do things that this younger audience that's coming through now, what are they not getting from the big studios? So we always try to see, even if we're doing genre films, what's the spin on it, or what's the sticky concept that just makes it different than what they've been getting from the major studios. So we just looked for fresh ways to tell genre films or new stories. In the 90s, the confluence of events in terms of us wanting to make more movies and a whole generation of writer-directors and filmmakers that came on the scene, which also kind of inspired everyone to be innovative.
Why were you able to take chances with young David Fincher and Paul Thomas Anderson, whereas the major studios weren't taking those?
I mean, again, out of necessity, like these were the lanes open to us. We weren't making movies at the budgets that big studios were. We didn't have IP or, the kind of franchises that the Warners and the Disneys and the Paramounts of the day had. We didn't have big producer deals or big producer relationships. So we had to be risky. There was a little courage involved, but really, to be honest with you, it was more necessity. These were the projects that were available to us. And then just within that, just trying to exercise some taste and judgment.
Did the budgets steadily grow little by little as you had success, or was there a big breakthrough?
94 was a breakthrough. The first year I ran production was 93, and the 94 slate, we had some lucky breaks with movies like The Mask and Dumb and Dumber. It was really, finding Jim Carrey after he had done Ace Ventura, but casting him before Ace Ventura had come out. So we caught a few lucky breaks that established the studio as a reliable supplier of films that aren't as expensive as studio films. We made a business out of sleeper hits, more of a high wire act, but we got off the ground with it in a successful way. And it kind of set the template for what we were trying to do to varying degrees of success until we got to Lord of the Rings.
This episode is brought to you by AMC and AMC Plus, presenting the critically acclaimed second season of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, praised as one of the year's most rewarding and remarkable hours of television by IndieWire, starring Jacob Anderson, Sam Reed, and Delaney Hales. For your consideration, go to amcfyc.com for more. What was your favorite movie that you were involved in that time?
Well, I mean, Wedding Singer was my first film that I was involved in, and that will always have incredible special.
So what was that? Tell me about working on that one.
Well, I was the junior executive, and at some point, probably shouldn't get into too much detail about it, but at some point I was put in charge of it at a very young age.
How old were you then?
I was probably 24.
Was there any part of you that said, I'm 24, I can't be in charge of a movie? Or
no, I think it's day-to-day kind of panic as opposed to 10,000-foot view panic. I think I don't want to talk too much out of school, but at some point, Bob was a little skeptical about the project. Mike, and I think Mike would probably admit this, but if not, I'll do it for him. He started spending money so we had no choice but to make the movie because he really believed in it.
What did that money go to? Developing scripts?
Developing scripts, but also like pre-production and probably, I mean, I don't know if this has ever been talked about, but yeah, he just started spending money, and we would basically lose more if we didn't make the movie than if we did. Mm-hmm. So, but the script was, being developed up to shooting, and we were going to Adam's house, getting new pages and going to his house in Bel Air every next morning and pitching our, notes and thoughts and other jokes. And that was just such an incredible experience to be in that room with him and other talented people, and Tim Hurley, the writer, and that was like being thrown right in the fire.
What did you learn from that experience?
One of the things that was interesting, just kind of on the business side, was that movie. That was one of those where Adam was, Happy Gilmore had come out and was successful, but really even bigger on home video. So by the time Wedding Singer came out, we got the benefit of that, and you could see the way someone's career could really just kind of take off. Yeah. And that, and just that was my first time going through the testing process, through the editorial process, all the, there were so many new news. And I remember specifically being at that first test screening and seeing it get such a great response, and, embarrassed to admit, but I had tears in my eyes, just that incredible joy of being part of something that was working, and the relief that comes from it not working.
And then how did it feel when the public
Yeah, it was great. I mean, Adam did this, we're supposed to take care of the talent, right? We buy them gifts and everything, especially when the movies open like that. Adam bought all of us DVD players. At that point, that was like,
That was the DVD
that just came out.
Wow.
It was like an $800 gift. I was 24 years old. No one ever got me something like that nice. It was, the whole thing was just a dream experience. And, had that not happened. And then Mike was incredibly generous and he actually took his name off the movie and gave me his credit.
Yeah.
And so that's responsible certainly for, I would say the better part of my career, at least for the first 10 years, I was drafting off of that movie that led to another movie that led to another movie.
Were you aware at the time that 24-year-olds aren't doing this at other companies?
Mike was like 30. So I felt like I was behind. I had to get my ass in gear if I was going to get anywhere near where he got.
Did friends at other companies just outrage and aghast that you were given such liberties while they were just getting coffee?
No. I don't know. I don't think there was. I remember everybody being kind of young then. I think now people are writing articles about how us old people won't leave. But at the time, it was a pretty young business and a really young company.
What was it about Hollywood at the time that was open to youth in a way that, there's no 20-somethings running anything right now?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. That's something that you will probably tell me the answer to.
It was a growing business, is the answer. So there were more seats that people would have to protect their seats.
I think so, yeah. And I think New Line was specific. I think Bob had an iconoclastic approach to the business that probably is more connected to youth. And certainly Mike, being this wonderkin executive, a funny story I tell Mike every now and then is before I worked at New Line, I used his name to get into clubs.
Oh, really?
I would call people, and just because I'd read an article about him in Premiere Magazine, the guy who wears the black t-shirt and the jeans and whatever and rides a motorcycle and is like the bad boy of Hollywood. So I figured he was probably going to, clubs and stuff. So I would call, and I didn't know anything about the business at all. So I would pretend I was him when probably his assistant would have set the whole thing up and never even bothered to have him. But I'd be like, hey, it's Mike De Luca. I got this producer from New York coming in. Could you put Richard Brener on the line? They're like, oh yeah, sure. And I would get into bars before I was already like a New Liner before I even worked there.
That's amazing. Yeah. Did you ever get caught?
I never got caught, no.
One thing that knows about the slate is that New Line had a openness to urban films and black films that wasn't happening at other studios.
Right.
Like how did that come about? And
I would assume, again, that was a little bit, they started a little bit before, I was kind of an executive, but I think that's just all Mike. I think that's just his taste. And I think we were making movies. We were using a lot of commercial and video directors as well. So he was clearly immersed in the youth culture, and that included obviously movies for black audiences. And I remember seeing Menace Society. It was before I worked there. I saw that. I snuck into a theater in DC when I thought I was going to go to law school. I was working for the public defender and saw Menace Society, and it was those were just great movies.
And the company was making films like Menace Society and Friday while other studios weren't making anything. Was that appreciated by black filmmakers that this was a home for?
I think black filmmakers and also, audience members. I think, if you look at every now and then someone on Twitter posts the New Line logo and says, what movies do you think of when this comes up? And it's always interesting to see it because it doesn't change a ton. It's, you see a lot of Nightmare on Elm Street, you see a lot of Friday, Menace to Society, Dumb and Dumber. And then for some reason, a lot of people think Home Alone was made at New Line.
Oh, really?
Half the people or a third of the people say, oh, that's definitely Home Alone. And of course, we didn't make that movie.
How do you suppose that?
I have no idea. They must have seen other movies at the same time in their lives and just seen that symbol and it meant, good movie to them.
You had some films, made a lot of independent films that did very respectably, Glenn Cleric and Ross and other things, but then you also had some monster hits in like Seven and Dumb and Dumber and Austin Powers. How did that change when you started to have giant hits like that?
It changed the company in a few ways. It increased our appetite for more films. We had a great 94, the two Jim Carrey movies, followed by in 95, Seven, and some other hits. A consequence of our success was just getting the attention of potential buyers. Turner came in with an idea to have an entertainment wing of his company that would be New Line, Castle Rock, and Turner Pictures. We became one of the three companies that he looked at to produce films, under the Turner banner before he sold to Time Warner. And that was a consequence of our success. We also took a side trip into trying to compete with the studios and flamed out with like 3 larger budget movies that proved that at least at that time, we had no idea how to make bigger films, and we quickly retreated back
Which were those?
Oh, they were a remake of Kurosawa's Yojimbo with Bruce Willis called Last Man Standing, a action film with Rennie Harlan called Long Kiss Goodnight, where we did slap down a $4 million price tag for it. We did get into the spec market and got infamous for it.
That was a Shane Black script.
Shane Black script, yeah. And then another infamous misstep, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which has been immortalized in article after article and a documentary.
Right.
Yeah.
How did those missteps feel? How did they?
Oh, it was horrible. It was humiliating because the first 2 years that my unit was running production, to have such a successful 94 and 95, and then 96 was the polar opposite and looked like we had no idea what we were doing, was also very educational, but really humiliating. But you do develop, with that level of lack of success in 1 year and have it be so public, that gives you some calluses in a good way too, of like learning how to be resilient and come back from that, and try again. And then we got back to our knitting, and that's when Austin Powers and Boogie Nights and Mortal Kombat all came out, in Pleasantville in 98 and Wag the Dog. Like we started to get back to 2 lanes, elevated genre movies, and then slightly fancier specialized movies. So we'd have a year where there'd be a Wag the Dog, but then an Austin Powers or a Boogie Nights or a Rush Hour. And those are the 2 lanes we tried to occupy until this opportunity with Lord of the Rings came about.
I remember just hearing on the sidelines, and I don't know if this is true at all, but that they were going to make each one for $60 million, I think. And then like the first one went over like a bunch. Still would be incredibly cheap today. Yeah. Especially for the size and scope of the film.
But that was, for New Line, it
was a big bet.
I mean, if that had gone wrong.
Yeah. There obviously was, again, the thing to know about New Line is like the pre-sale model, did reduce risk because all the international partners were paying for those movies. I don't know what would happen if it went wildly over budget, but it would have been bad, but I don't think it would have been devastating, not unlike, I guess, how Lionsgate still does, a lot of movies where there's protection from maybe the partners get killed, but you don't get as killed.
So at this time you had Turner come in, and then Turner was acquired by Time Warner. So with Turner, it was a corporation, but it was a relatively freewheeling.
Another maverick
corporation. And then Time Warner, you were working for a conglomerate.
Yeah.
How did that change things?
I think, being there in the early years of Turner, I felt that change. I felt like the influx of more money and the ability to expand the slate and take bigger chances. Time Warner from Turner didn't feel massive to me, but I could imagine for other people, now that I've been through several different, ownerships in maybe a higher position, you feel them all acutely. But at the time, I didn't really feel a difference between Turner and Time Warner as much as being completely independent and Turner.
Did you feel the culture evolving in a more...
We were very protected, I think, by Bob and Mike. New Line didn't change in any of those things. We still stayed where we were on Robertson. There was, no one said, okay, now it's time for ties and jackets. No new professionalism was introduced to the situation.
So when Lord of the Rings was in progress, you're making this giant trilogy there. Do you still feel like, we'll spend $5 million on this little? Can you play at the smaller tables while you've got a seat at the big tables?
I think so. I don't think I think more people thought of Lord of the Rings as an outlier than the new way things were going to be done. So you could still cry poverty in all your other films.
So New Line kind of kept its day job while they were doing that.
Yeah. Later, there was this, feeling like we started to take bigger bets, and that New Line Lord of the Rings didn't feel like that departure. But when we were starting to make like Long Kiss Goodnight and Last Man Standing and a couple others in that, where we started to go to like $40 and $50 million, where people were like, what is New Line? And then I think some of those didn't really work out, and we kind of went back to the...
So this is the traditional trajectory of independent studios, that the bets get bigger and bigger until they can't cover their losses anymore. Was that the story of...
I think that there wasn't enough movies to really prove that point, but people made that point nonetheless. I think, if you were a stats person, you would say 3 movies does not make a rule, but this town, probably 1 movie is enough for everyone to say, oh, that's a trend.
You always talked about in comparison to Miramax at the time, but there's something, well, Miramax had this sort of august prestige. New Line was always cooler.
We were young. The people that worked with me, we were all relatively the same age, and we were pop culture junkies, and we liked commercial stuff. Like, we didn't think having some artistry in your commercial fare, like that they were mutually exclusive. So we had very pop sensibilities. It was a very Gen X group of people, pretty poppy vibe. And there was an urgency to, like, almost a producerial spirit more than executive spirit of, like, getting movies together, that spoke to our generation and pop culture.
I remember the New Line office in the 1990s. It seemed like the coolest place in the world. You were in this building above Newsroom, which was
on Robertson. Yeah.
Yes, which was the coolest sort of restaurant to be at around the corner from Chaya. It just seemed like the hub of so much vibrant activity. What was it like working there at the time?
It was great. I mean, we got very fortunate that we intersected with people, like Donna Langley and Mary Parent, Richard Brener, who's still here, obviously. Toby Emmerich was head of music back then. It was a great group. Each of them were very ambitious to have a career. They all had great taste in material. It was a moment in time where we were fortunate to intersect with these people as they were just coming up, and they brought tremendous energy and taste and joy to the job. We were just so fortunate to reap the benefits of that energy. And I'm so proud of everyone, of where everyone's gone on to.
So many people have gotten into amazing careers, came out of there. What did you all learn about, what was in the water that taught you about management and about making movies there that people have taken on?
The environment had no fear. You had to be fearless to take risks if you wanted to get an edge over the competition or get to the cool things first. But also, I think part of it was we were all relatively young and hadn't learned to be afraid or had responsibilities. None of us had families. None of us had, anything except our love of movies and our desire to do something different than the big studios were doing. We tried to give people the runway and enough authority and delegate enough where people really felt like they could shine or prove that they could deliver a hit movie and then serve them up to the powers that be to greenlight and to release into the world.
What kind of hours did you work there?
We worked 24/7. Like, we just enjoyed it, so we all hated taking vacations. Everybody loved movies, being around directors and writers and agents and managers. We talked movies like 24/7.
Now, you yourself have kept your job for
until today, probably.
Until this goes in the air.
When exactly should I patent my shit?
So tell me about staying at New Line all this time, and it's evolved. And
I've been very lucky. I mean, again, had I gotten that Sony gig for $4 more an hour, I don't know that I would still be around. But, I think one of the things that has been great about New Line, something that I've certainly tried to keep, is I think people do a better job when they're not worried about their job. For as tough as Bob was, or even, Mike can be on results, they didn't fire people. And I think that one of the mistakes this town has had through the years is people have been credited for being too smart for a hit and too dumb for a bomb. And I think there's a little bit more. I think New Line has kind of been like, well, if I like this person, if they're smart and they're good, bad movies can happen for a lot of different reasons that don't happen to be just from an executive. And then, certainly in like the later years, I think 2008 on when we came over to Warner Brothers, and there was this expectation that they were going to run the gas out, and no one at Warner Brothers wanted New Line. At least that's what the whole town, I'm sure you wrote that several times. We were lucky that we were able to, when we got downsized significantly, I think going from 600 to like 50 employees, those that we kept really understood that if any of us failed, we all failed. And we became really tight knit, and people would, instead of those weekend read meetings where everyone would try to kill each other's projects, it was always about trying to lift them. And I benefited from that for sure. And also I think being part of the big company like Warner Brothers, you get so many benefits of the scale. You're trailering on bigger movies than you were before. You've got top A-class marketing and distribution. And because we don't make movies for toys or release dates historically, we could zig and zag and find like a crease where no one else is. And because our movies often don't have a ton of visual effects, they can also be turned around pretty quickly. And so you could maybe stay ahead of trends and not, find yourself making the second version of something else that people are already over. So we've had some benefits, but we've also realized that like we kind of have to succeed or there's a good chance that they're going to get rid of us, because there was a time, I think we went something like 14 for 14 when we first came into Warner Brothers. And the first movie that lost money, we lost 30% of our overhead.
No.
So I think we were right to be paranoid. But we've been very lucky to have support from above. Alan was a big supporter, Alan Horn, and obviously, Toby ended up getting promoted into a bigger job at Warner Brothers, and having Mike and Pam, certainly, like, those are a bunch of lucky breaks that could have been the end of Mayfair very quickly.
What's one of your favorite movies that you made in that period? And tell me the story of it coming in.
It's hard to play favorites because there were so many great experiences. Finding Paul and putting together a Boogie Nights and the execution of it was just glorious, because he's just one of those filmmakers where, it's like watching Michael Jordan play basketball. So that was a wonderful experience.
And he was insanely young also.
Very young. And watching Barry Levinson and Robert De Niro develop Wag the Dog into the movie it became with David Mamet was an incredible lesson in just artistry. And David Mamet wrote that script so fast. We had an original script that was a different approach to an adaptation of this book, American Hero, it was based on. And Barry and De Niro decided it needed to go in a different direction. They recruited Mamet. He understood the homework assignment. And I just couldn't believe how quickly he wrote what essentially was a shooting script.
How fast was it?
I feel like it was a week, but it was probably longer. It was probably a month or whatever. But I remember, we had one meeting in San Francisco and a script showed up, and then Barry Levinson had to get it shot before he went off to do Sphere for Warner Brothers, that movie with Dustin Hoffman. So Wag the Dog had to be a 21-day schedule. And it was a perfect example of what the studios were doing with Barry Levinson, which was Sphere, and what we were doing with him, which was 21-day scheduled Wag the Dog, which had cultural relevance and has stood the test of time. So that was a wonderful experience. Seven was another really singular peek into the process of just an exemplary artist. David pitched the movie, in a spellbinding way. When we were interviewing for directors for it, he came in and gave a verbal pitch that had me at the word go. Like, it was just so wonderful to just hear him talk about the movie he wanted to shoot. And then he actually did photographic storyboards. Like, he shot photographs that were his storyboards, basically, that he showed to us for certain sequences. And it was just so visually precise. And the movie was made with so much integrity, and the final result. It was one of the first times it was the first time we ever had a movie not drop from Friday to Sunday, but actually go up because of word of mouth. Back then, word of mouth was really what you depended on. There was no internet and no social media, and you had your trailer and TV spots, but the word of mouth on the movie was really a testament to the execution of the movie by him.
With the ending, you went through some back and forth there, I believe.
Yeah, the back and forth on the ending was David had an initial instinct to end the movie after Brad Pitt shoots John Doe. It would just go to black. And you'd hear, I think John McGinley, this actor John McGinley, was the cop whose voice we hear on the police radio. You'd hear John McGinley say, get someone, and it would just go to black. We felt there was a coda involving Brad Pitt being taken away in a police car and Morgan Freeman saying, I'll be back on the job on Monday, and a quote that ends the movie. And we thought that was a better way to go. And David considered both, and in the end agreed that the coda was the way to go. But that was the one debate we had about the ending. I know people talk about the head in the box, but that was never up for debate. There was a draft that we bought it in turnaround from this company, Penta, and they had developed a draft that didn't have the head in the box. But the first thing we did when we got a hold of the project was to put the head in the box ending back in.
Now, that seems like a movie that if it had been handled anywhere else, might very well not have had such a happy result.
I think that's why it hadn't gotten made. New Line, for better or worse, did make a lot of movies that other places had refused to make. Austin Powers, we were the last stop. We weren't the first stop for Boogie Nights either. Seven had been around as a turnaround project for a while. So we were not afraid of trying things that we liked, even if other people had passed on them or decided not to make them. There were certain movies I think only could have gotten made with us.
How did the town start to treat you in 94, 95 when you started to have success there?
We were all very graciously treated in terms of, I think the town I think the talent, which is really what I mean when I say the town, the creative community was grateful that there was another door to take material, another place that wasn't shy about taking risks and was just into making movies. It just meant more work for people and more chances for filmmakers to tell their stories. So we were met with enthusiasm because we were doing things, and we were less restrictive in our approach to casting and the criteria to get a movie made. So I think, people appreciated that we were more open-minded to more risks.
One thing that's always fascinated me is that the executives at New Line you were all encouraged to write screenplays, and you all have screenplay credits from this period.
I wouldn't say we were encouraged. It was tolerated. Like it wasn't not allowed. And it just so happened that Toby and I and a fellow named Jeffrey Reddick, who worked with us, who wrote the original draft for Final Destination, we enjoyed trying it or attempting it to varying degrees of success. I don't think I ended up being a very good writer. I think Toby's a very good writer. And I think Jeffrey came up with one of the best horror franchise ideas, in history.
Did it teach you a lot as an executive?
Oh my God. Yeah. It taught me to really appreciate good writing. And I think it gave me a sensitivity to what writers go through. I think writers and actors have the hardest road sometimes in terms of constantly being told no or constantly being the last to receive new information. It did make me very sensitive to what it must feel like when you're on the outside of the information pipeline and your fate's being decided on by people that are not in the room with you.
Now, New Line is a specialty in horror now, which has been a part of the New Line lineup slate since the beginning. Right. So what does New Line know about horror?
Part of it is horror and comedy, which I think we'd also like to think we've been pretty good at, are bedfellows in that they're audience facing. You can get a really very clear response from the audience of whether it's working or not. And we really believe in testing and screening the movie and still understanding that there's sometimes low scores don't necessarily mean the movie's bad. There's obviously famous stories at New Line of low testing and high testing movies that performed the opposite of what they looked like they were going to from testing. But, I think we can put ourselves in the theater and imagine what would scare us. We're lucky. The things that would scare us or make us laugh are the things that have also done that for the audience.
Yeah.
And we're not trying to, I don't know how much we're trying to recreate a new thing as opposed to just making sure that the audience is happy.
So you have a lot of hits, you have some down periods, and then comes Lord of the Rings. How does that happen, and how does that change everything?
So that really happened because of this fellow Mark Ordesky, who worked at New Line at the time. And Mark and I were both genre fans, and he and I, years previous, had tried to get Peter Jackson to write a Nightmare on Elm Street film. And he actually allowed himself to be hired and wrote, somewhere in the files, there's a treatment from Peter Jackson on a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel.
He was doing these Australian horror movies.
Because horror is my first love, and Mark Ordesky also loved horror films. We were giant fans of Dead Alive, his zombie film. We loved Meet the Feebles, his profane Muppet parody. We just were all in for Peter Jackson and thought he was a singular talent. So Mark Ordesky kept that relationship going. And when Lord of the Rings was developed at Miramax, from what I remember or what I heard at the time, they had two scripts. Miramax couldn't get them approved by Disney. Disney felt, well, this is you stepping into our territory in terms of big budget family movies. From what I remember, they weren't going to approve making two movies at the same time. And I think Peter was coming off The Frighteners at Universal. So there were question marks about Peter. We didn't have any question marks about Peter. So Miramax allowed Peter to shop it and turn around. So Mark Ordesky brought the project in to New Line, and then my old boss, Bob Shaye, heard the pitch and decided in a very, brave exercise of instinct that it should be 3 movies, not 2, and made the deal to make the movies all at the same time if he would turn it into 3 scripts, events that's, very singular in the history of our business. And Bob bet the farm on that project, and it paid off.
I mean, how does that change things for a company when, you've been doing small character films and
I wish I could tell you, because what happened to me is that year I was coming off a not great year. At 99, if I remember correctly, was not a great year for New Line. So Bob had met me when I was 19. I'd been there for 16 years. We had a very up and down relationship. And it had gotten to the point where, combined with the failures, I had to leave. So I was either leaving at the end of that year when my contract was up, which is what I would have preferred to do, because that would have had me still there when Lord of the Rings was released in December. But he had it with me at the beginning of the year and didn't want me anywhere near Lord of the Rings when it came out. So they fired me. So I wasn't around to see how it changed the company. Toby was already installed.
So what was that like for you? You had been working for New Line since you were in college. What was that like suddenly not working there?
It was devastating. It was like being thrown out of your home. But I understood why, because I knew I had to leave to grow and to just change the environment anyway. I was going to try to leave under my own steam. You know, it's that old story of like, you'd rather not be broken up with, you'd rather be the person doing the breaking up. So I wanted to leave at the end of the year. But it was very humbling. Getting fired is a very humbling experience and does give you a lot of life lessons and wisdom about being resilient, coming back from failure, and realizing one of the great things about our business is you can go from massive failure to massive success overnight. It's just about making the right job choice or picking the right script or staking the right filmmaker. It can all turn around on a dime or go the other way on a dime, as long as you're in it for the long haul and aren't going to torture the failures more than they deserve to be. And you're really going to learn to treasure the hits when you have them. Because I started to think, well, everybody has flops. Not everybody has hits, and I've had hits, and that must mean something. And that kind of just gave me the self-confidence to go on.
Success and failure now, does it feel the same as it did when you were...
You know, it does. It feels great when it works and it's validating and you're happy for all the people it touches, from the filmmakers to your colleagues to your boss. And it's humiliating and hurts when it doesn't work, and you mourn it like a death in the family, and you try to do a postmortem and understand why it happened and learn what you can, but then you got to keep moving forward.
Film is fundamentally, you never know if there's going to be you never know if the project is going to turn out well. There's so many things that have to come together, and you never know if there's going to be an audience for it. By the time it comes out, tastes may have totally changed. The world might have moved on from this thing. It's always interesting. So it involves a kind of willingness to take crazy chances. Is that easier to do when you're young than you're old, and easier to do when you're an upstart company than at Warner Brothers?
I can only speak for myself. It was definitely easier when I was young. I just had less anxiety. I have a lot more anxiety now. It's harder, but I feel it's so imperative. If you do the job like you're afraid to lose it, you don't take risks, you're not innovative, and you don't hit the refresh button on the industry. So then you really are locked into just doing remakes and sequels and reboots, which are fine. You know, they obviously work. The top movies this year are all sequels or remakes and reboots. We had a couple of them. But I'll go to my grave believing that it can't just be that. To have new franchises or new filmmakers that can go on a 10-year run, like a Chris Nolan or whomever, you have to, for the right price point, invest in originality. And to do that, you really have to have nerves of steel and be willing to walk this high wire act. Even though there's more capital in the industry than there was certainly when I was in my neck of the woods in the 90s, it's a more challenging environment post-streaming and post-pandemic. The theater-going business is not where it was pre-pandemic levels. So you're kind of working without a net. You have to have things connect with audiences in a way where quality control is more important. It was always important. But in the boom time of the 90s with the DVD boom, you could get away if something missed and wasn't quite the best version of itself. If it was in a genre that drove DVD sales, you recovered. I think a good thing for the consumer is it's not that way anymore. Things really have to be of a certain quality to break through. And because of social media, people know if they love it and will market it for you and turn it into a phenomenon if they love it. And in the other direction, if they hate it or it's not what they wanted and they want to mobilize against it, you are out of business on Saturday morning. Whereas at least in the old days, you could maybe limp to Monday. On the other side of the coin, if they adopt it and make an event out of it, you have Barbie. So there are things that are better about this era and easier, and then there are also things that are harder. But I still think you can't do the job with fear in the system. You have to feel fearless.
What advice would you give to young Richard Brener getting out of college today and coming into today's industry? Would you say get a temp job at New Line or?
Well, I don't know what our pay is. I would check at Sony. But it's a tough business. I don't know that I would recommend coming in from an agency side, which is the traditional ways that we were all told when we were coming up, work in the mailroom or work at the studio. I think there's so many ways to prove yourself in a kind of do-it-yourself way that, I don't know, I would say like you better really like it because there's fewer and fewer opportunities and it's getting tougher every year. But I do think that cream does rise to the top and eventually hard work and creativity does get seen. It's probably easier to get seen now than it was in the past, but there's not as many opportunities.
What advice would you give to young Mike De Luca getting out of NYU today?
My experience was so specific to me. When I do talk to people who are coming into our industry, if you want to get on the production side of things or make things, just go make something. It's much easier now to literally make a whole movie. You can make it on your phone, show up at a festival, to not wait in line, but to dive in and make something if that's what you want to do. If you want to get into a studio system or want to get into producing, to not try to be what other people think you need to be to succeed, but to follow your own instincts and to try to be just true to what is driving you to do this, because it's not an easy industry. It's got to be about love and passion. There are so many easier ways to make a lot of money. You know, I would go to Silicon Valley if I wanted to get on that rocket ship or do almost anything else. It's a really speculative career trying to break into the arts and the business of the arts. So you have to really love it. And if you're in it for the love of it, you got to follow your own internal instincts and passion.
Final question. This is a season of podcasts about the 1990s specifically. Mm-hmm. If you were planning a film festival about the 1990s and you wanted to show, what would be the 3 films you'd and you can pick your own or you can pick...
True Romance was definitely, that's the movie that's responsible for me working in the business, so I would probably pick that one. Goodfellas, obviously, classic, and Forrest Gump.
Great lineup.
Yeah.
Great night. Thank you, Richard Brener.
Thank you.
Final question here. This is a season of episodes about the 1990s I'm doing. If you're programming a 1990s film festival, what would be the 3 films that you would show in that festival? Maybe not the best films, but capture the era.
I would say Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Pulp Fiction, and Seven. Paul's going to kill me. I love Boogie Nights, but there's just something about what Steven Soderbergh announced with that movie that led to a movement that I think kind of includes Boogie Nights. I have Boogie Nights on a continuum, even a little bit with Pulp Fiction, but Pulp Fiction was also kind of a signal moment of what was possible. And then when we were more of a regular studio, which is when Seven was put out, I do feel like Seven pointed the way to what a Hollywood studio could bring to the table in terms of this new audience. Even though we were still New Line, we were no longer an independent. We were part of Time Warner, or at least part of Turner, but it may have been Time Warner even at that time. For me, those 3 movies will always be indicative of like the change that happened in that era in the 90s.
So that is our show and that is our season. Thanks to Michael De Luca, Richard Brener, and also to Adam Leff, Zach Penn, Winnie Holtzman, Ron Meyer, and Drew McQueenie for being the test subjects on this first round. We're going to be back soon with another season of Hollywood Stories. If you have a story that you think might be pod-worthy, drop me a line at richard@theankler.com, and tell me about it, or tell me what you thought about this series in general. Goodbye from the 1990s.